Good morning. This morning's scripture reading will be out of Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake has forgiven you.
Sure, it's good to see everybody, and I wanted to say I know there's a lot of visitors here this morning, and I was a visitor about 3-4 years ago. Sarah and I have been here about that long, and I would highly recommend this congregation. One thing that impressed me the most is how many are daily Bible readers, and just so you know, on January 1st, we've kind of committed as a congregation for those who are interested to read the whole Bible together over a 2-year period. So if you're interested in that, we'll give you some more information as that approaches. And that I'm not sure there's many congregations you could pull that off where there's that much dedication. And I know there's a lot of good congregations out there, but this is definitely one of them. We also, in case you're interested, on Wednesday nights, a couple of Wednesday nights a month, we get together and talk about what we've been studying. Whatever comes to mind. We've been calling it the roundtable class, where we come and bring things, different verses we've been talking about or thinking about. And so I've learned a lot since I've been here, and I would really commend this congregation to you if you happen to be this way again. I'm going to talk about my favorite teacher. I remember her name very clearly. Clearly, her name was Miss Tony. I've thought about looking her up once in a while. It was 10th grade. It was a history class. Like a lot of kids in their 10th grade year, they weren't necessarily a fan of history, but she made her students fans of history. And ever since then, it's been more interesting to me because I was in Miss Tony's class. And I think the trick was that she found stuff that was kind of behind the scenes. There's the stuff that the history books told you, the standard issue student book, but then she dug a little deeper and found out all the stuff that, a lot of people didn't know. And so ever since then, the behind-the-scenes stuff has kind of been interesting to me, and whenever I come across something like that, it kind of sticks out in my mind. And I came across something not long ago that I'm going to use kind of for our own use as Christians this morning, and it's about the Spanish-American War, 1898. There's not going to be a test, but I'll give you some details. 1898, the U.S. went to war with Spain. It's not one of your more famous wars, but I bet you remember hearing about it. It lasted from April to August. It was 10 weeks long. Pretty short war. What was going on was Spain was in control of Cuba, and Cuba wanted independence. They said, we don't want Spain to be running things anymore. And so the U.S. got involved. President McKinley was in the White House at the time. You may know that Teddy Roosevelt, who would later be president, you probably heard about him charging San Juan Hill. That happened during this war. And this is also the war where it ended up where Puerto Rico is now under kind of U.S. jurisdiction. So it was that war. And I want to go ahead and give a disclaimer. This lesson is not a commentary on modern political decisions or situations. I'm bringing this up because, first of all, it was kind of interesting to me, but I think there's some details about this that might be of use to us as Christians. So it's not a commentary about the world. It's a commentary about you and me, which might be harder to take. I don't know. But the U.S. was in a situation, they were trying to help Cuba gain independence from Spain, and the U.S. had a ship off the coast of Cuba, and it was in the Havana Harbor, and this is what you need to remember. The ship's name was the USS Maine, like the state, M-A-I-N-E. It was a 300-foot-long ship in the harbor at Cuba. And one day, news reached the U.S., and the report said that a Spanish mine had sunk the USS Maine. 266 men died in this explosion. Made a lot of people mad, and back here in the States, a lot of people were demanding it's time to go to war. And if you lived back then, you would have heard one particular phrase mentioned over and over again. If you went to work or you're talking to your friends, you would hear this phrase, remember the Maine. It was kind of like remember the Alamo. It was a motivation for action. And people shouted, remember the Maine, and they shouted it over and over long enough to where the U.S. the leadership decided to go to war. And going to war is not uncommon. Conflict happens on a grand scale all the time. I looked it up. Right now there's 67 wars going on. 67 wars. One nation turns against another nation, and it's nothing unusual. It's kind of par for the course with this world. But what I want to talk about, I think this happens on an individual basis, on a smaller scale, people and other people. We don't call them wars, we call them disagreements or conflicts. And if someone does you wrong, the natural response is to respond in turn in the same way. And chances are, no one's going to plant a mine in your front yard. So this lesson is not about guns or fists or war or anything like that. The more realistic possibility is someone's going to gossip about you. Somebody's going to say something about you or say something vicious directly to you. Or this is a popular phrase, they're going to throw you under the bus. I've heard that term a lot lately. I think it started in the corporate world or maybe in RTD, I don't know. But it started somewhere. Two people are not getting along, and one hears about the other, and they say, oh yeah, they threw you under the bus. I think that's a very interesting way to put it. There's this bus coming, and they grab you, and they throw you right in front of it. It's pretty mean. But what it really means is they badmouthed you. They kind of left you there to face the consequences, I guess, and they worked against you. And it's hard not to get caught up in that, to become another bus thrower under like everybody else. But something important for us to remember, Christians are defined by specific characteristics. Here's one in John 13:35. It's pretty important when you live in a world where people are throwing people under buses, so to speak. Here's John 13:35. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. You don't throw each other under buses. So one key characteristic of a Christian is love. That love might lead to discipline. We've been talking about that in class. But even then, a Christian is known for being nice, I guess is the best way to put it. I'm a teacher, and years ago at the school where I teach, I happened to be in the back where the little kids were having recess. I mainly deal with the older ones, and I happened to be back there where the little kids were playing, and there was a disagreement between two little girls, and I happened to be standing nearby, and one little girl turned to the other and said, I never want to be your friend again. I'm never going to be your friend again. I remember thinking, that's a little over the top, but to this day, these two little kids don't speak. They avoid each other. They badmouth each other. They throw each other into the bus. No, that's not true, is it? You know what? 5 minutes later, everything was fine. It had been forgotten. If I had brought it up and said, hey, you're not supposed to be friends, right? They would have looked at me like I was crazy. That's an interesting thing about us as human beings. We have to learn to hold grudges. It's not something that we just that we have when we're little. We develop the tendency to hang on to bad feelings. And I think we've all had our turn doing this. God is very much opposed to this, as Omar just read for us. Here's Ephesians 4:31. Let all bitterness and wrath and danger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you. God is essentially telling us, be nice. And it's pretty thorough. I don't see any caveats or loopholes or exceptions here. It doesn't say unless you've had a bad day, or unless they did you wrong, or unless they threw you under a bus. It doesn't say that. When it comes to being a Christian, there's a zero malice policy, especially between Christians. And you've heard it before, where they say, well, a grudge only hurts, you. One example of that, I think, is one of the best ones I ever heard. This woman, I guess it's a true story, she did not like this one particular guy. I think it was a preacher that said something that really struck her. It was very irritating to her. And so she held a grudge against this guy. I guess she left and even, lived in another state for a while. And she harbored this anger towards this guy. It was definitely a grudge. And so it finally kind of came around where the light kind of came on. She said, you know what, this is wrong. And she happened to be back in her town again where he was. And she pulled him aside after the assembly and said, I want you to know, I forgive you. And he said, I'm sorry, who are you? He didn't even remember her. And yet, she thought she was, damaging him or causing him some kind of pain. He didn't even recall who she was. He was nice enough about it and apologized. I'm so sorry. I don't remember who you are. Could have made her more mad. But the point for her is that all this time, the only one involved in this was her. Be nice is really good advice for the playground, but you need to remember it as adults. I do. It's a deal breaker for our souls. 1 John 13:35, it says, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And it's not always easy, but it's crucial. One thing about being in the light of the world is it makes you an easy target, and it goes with the territory. It's just a matter of time before somebody's going to be mean to you. So it's important to be prepared whenever you're faced with a confrontation, especially with another Christian. When the conflict comes, and it will, the first question is not what did they do to you. It's not who did they hurt. It's not who's right and who's wrong. The first and primary question is, do you love them? Your answer is very important, not only because it will determine what you do next, but also because it defines you. How you react to conflict with people is a key indicator of whether or not your Christianity is real. And there's good reasons to be nice. First of all, it's a command. Another good reason, another fun reason to be nice is it kind of shakes things up. And I'm going to explain this in a roundabout way. My family used to live in, my cousins, they lived in Rifle, Colorado. And some of you know where that is. And they lived right next door to the church building. And I'm going to tell you what I did. We got a super ball. Some of you know what that is. It's like a really good bouncy ball. And we went in to the church building when it was a Saturday. There's a bunch of wooden pews and a wooden floor, and we stood out in the foyer. The entrance was right there, and we threw it as hard as we could in the auditorium. We were bored. And it was entertaining for quite a while until I thought, I'm going to really get a good bounce out of this one. I reared back, and I hit the cross with a lintel or whatever across above the door there, about 2 feet away, bounced off really hard, hit me right in the mouth, knocked me down. My cousins were standing over me kind of laughing, saying, "Are you all right?" And so it knocked me down. And that's the nature of the super ball and the wall. It's going to bounce right back at you. That's the nature of these things. And the same is true with people. If you're mean to them, in general, they're going to be mean right back. Whatever you throw at them, it's going to bounce back. And that gives a Christian a huge opportunity. 1 Thessalonians 5:15. "See that no one repays another with evil for evil, but always seek after that which is good for one another and for all people." When someone yells at you and says something mean, this puts you in a position of incredible advantage to not yell back, to not say something mean, to not bounce back. When I was a kid and I threw that ball, if I threw it at something and it didn't bounce back, it would get my attention. I'd take a closer look. Say, something's off about this. Everything else, it bounces back, but not here. And maybe that's how it works with people. If malice doesn't bounce off you, they might take a closer look. When you're dealing with lost souls, every advantage is incredibly important. It's incredibly valuable. So being nice is definitely a command. It's an opportunity. There's another very good reason to be nice. I'll share one more with you. I'm going to go back to the Spanish-American War. After the war was over, the wreckage of the USS Maine was examined 3 times. The first 2 took place in 1898, the year that the war ended. The first investigations, U.S. divers, I didn't even know you could dive back then in 1898, but they did. And divers from the United States went down there and looked at the wreckage. And then the second investigation, Spanish divers went down to look at the wreckage. Nothing conclusive. 13 years later, in 1911, there was another investigation, and they reviewed the reports of the first 2 investigations. Stick with me, there's a point. And they found out the later investigation, the third one, discovered that the first 2 were inconclusive because the water was so muddy, you couldn't see much. So 13 years after the war was over, they did a final investigation of the wreckage, and they built a cofferdam. I'd never heard of this before. What they did is they built a room underwater around the wreckage, and then they drained the water. So there was this room around the submerged ship, and they were able to drain the water and be down there. It's pretty amazing. And be down there in a dry area and really take a look at the wreckage. They took the water out. It was much easier to examine. They took a bunch of photographs, but it wasn't until the 1980s that all the evidence was examined by the Taylor Research and Development Center and the Surface Weapons Center. I'm telling you all this so you know I'm not making it up. All these boring details are important because of the conclusion of this report. Admiral Rickover confirmed the report. The explosion that sank the USS Maine, the explosion that started the war, was caused by 20,000 pounds of powder that blew up from the inside. That means the USS Maine sank itself. It wasn't an attack. That flabbergasted me. I was really startled by that. And of course, in hindsight, we have the luxury of looking back and saying, oh, the mistakes of the past. And maybe at most just an interesting bit of history, but it might be a good reminder that things aren't always what they seem, especially when it comes to our interactions with other people. We have a tendency to blame everyone but ourselves. I do this, and I see it in myself. Have you ever done this? I remember being at a congregation more than once in the past and sitting there thinking, well, the preacher's talking, and he's being pretty pointed about stuff, and I'm sitting there thinking, boy, I sure hope so-and-so's here. They really need to hear this. They really need to hear this. I sure hope they're paying attention. Guess what happens if everybody's thinking that? This all leads to a very important reason to be nice, to be forgiving, because someday it's going to be your turn. Tomorrow or later this week, when you face a conflict, hesitate. At least that. Hesitate. Be nice, first because it's God's will and it defines a Christian. Also be nice because it's an opportunity to reach the lost. Malice doesn't bounce off you like everyone else, and people are going to notice that. But it's also important to hesitate for another very good reason. Before you declare war on another person, it's important to pause and consider the possibility it might be you. There are conflicts coming, and when you're in the next one, when you're angry, I have some advice. Remember the Maine. It's hard to always do the right thing, but it's expected. Inevitably, we will fail. But we get back up and we try again. For any Christian, the blood of Jesus removes our mistakes, and this gives us another chance to do better. If you're not a Christian this morning, I need to be up front. You will carry your mistakes on your own, and they get very heavy. If you haven't been baptized, life will become a greater and greater burden, and we would encourage you to be baptized to get those mistakes off your back. And we're here to encourage each other, to help each other get to heaven. And this is an opportunity for us to make some headway in that regard. Before you leave this morning, if you want to pull anybody aside, if you're at a point where you want some more questions answered, I know that myself and others would be very happy, more than happy to talk to you before you leave, if you want to pull us aside before you head on out, if you have any questions. But I hope you'll think about all of this while we stand together and sing.